The sun was an obliging presence that morning, shining with a rather too insistent cheerfulness over Flaxborough. In the neatly swept precinct of the town's civic gardens, ribbons of colour flowed in disciplined lines, marigolds, dahlias, carnations. The annual flower show, a tradition not so much revered as endured, was in full swing. It was the kind of event where the main excitement came not from horticultural prowess, but from the thinly veiled rivalries among exhibitors and the occasional scandal among spectators. Mrs. Pritchard, of Willow Street, had whispered all week about the suspiciously luxuriant hydrangeas of her neighbour, Mrs. Chalmers, and one suspected, on account of a mysterious late-night visitor, that the Chalmers had employed some illicit fertiliser. Inspector Purbright, however, had attended not for gossip, but for the soothing rhythm of public civility, the gentle ebb and flow of mundane disputes, and the small satisfaction of knowing that nothing very dangerous ever really happened here. A brief encounter with the town clerk's assistant, a young man liable to overstate both his own importance and that of every pot plant he watered, confirmed that the show had, so far, remained resolutely unremarkable. That steadiness ended at precisely 11:37. It began, as such things do, in a manner entirely innocuous. Mr. Trench, the town's self-appointed arbiter of taste and owner of several improbably fragrant roses, gave a sudden, startled exclamation. "Well, I never," he said, placing a gloved hand over his heart. Heads turned, polite murmurs rippled. Mrs. Pritchard fanned herself dramatically, and Miss Tolliver, the youngest of the local spinster cohort, flapped her hands in a faintly theatrical alarm. Purbright moved toward the gathering, adopting his customary air of quiet observation. What had Mr. Trench seen? The inspector's eyes, keen despite their polite, weary expression, swept over the crowd. A small, crumpled note lay at the foot of the display table of chrysanthemums. At first glance it seemed trivial, a scrap of paper almost lost among petals. Yet Purbright noticed, as he had learned to notice over a quarter-century of watching Flaxborough's citizens, that the note had been deliberately positioned to attract attention without startling anyone immediately. He picked it up. The words were typed in a neat, formal typeface, and the message was brief, almost absurdly so. "The Virgin has perished." A murmur ran through the crowd, but not the kind of shocked gasp one might expect. It was more of a curious rustle, as though the words were an enigmatic puzzle rather than a declaration of death. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes, wide behind her spectacles, darted about the assembled townspeople as if she were calculating blame. Mr. Trench, his pride affronted by any disturbance to his roses, seemed on the verge of faint indignation. "Some absurd prank, I should imagine," he said, in a tone suggesting both disbelief and personal affront. "Or a rather poor attempt at poetry," Miss Tolliver offered, peering over her lorgnette. Purbright did not respond immediately. Instead, he noted who was there, who lingered close enough to read the note, and who, with subtle yet telling discomfort, edged back. These were the behavioural clues of human nature, far more revealing than fingerprints or ink. The flower show secretary, a diminutive woman with sharp eyes and a relentless devotion to rules, approached Purbright cautiously. "Inspector," she whispered, "there has been a complaint. From someone. Well, they say it's urgent." Her gloved hand quivered slightly as she produced a second note, identical in form. Purbright took it, reading in the same detached, almost academic manner. This one added only a single cryptic line. "Meet me at the Red Lion at 6. At that, a ripple of interest moved through those nearby. The Red Lion, known more for its modest ale and occasional croquet matches in summer, was hardly the sort of place one expected to feature in such cryptic communications. Purbright stored the detail mentally. The crowd, meanwhile, speculated. Mr. Trench pronounced that it was a scandalous attempt to draw attention away from his prized dahlias, while Mrs. Pritchard fretted about the youth of today and their preoccupation with impropriety. Miss Tolliver suggested, with a faintly conspiratorial glimmer, that it might be connected to last year's flower theft, a minor yet socially shocking event. Purbright observed the gossip as one might observe the movement of water in a gently flowing stream. It was predictable, yet endlessly informative. People revealed their anxieties, ambitions, and jealousies without even realizing it. By noon, the police sergeant on duty had begun taking statements, though in a notably perfunctory fashion. He seemed rather eager to attribute the matter to mischievous schoolboys or, failing that, a prankster from the nearby railway station. Purbright, however, refrained from speculation. Later, as the midday sun leaned westward, he wandered through the exhibition tents, exchanging civil words with exhibitors, noting minor contradictions and inconsistencies. One elderly gentleman claimed he had not seen the note because he had been admiring the begonias, yet his fingers were smudged with ink. A young woman insisted she had arrived late, yet the dais where she stood could only have been reached after passing within inches of the note. Small-town mysteries rarely burst into flame. They smoulder, revealing their character in layers. Purbright understood that the apparent absurdity of the message was a mask, concealing something or someone worthy of attention. As the show drew to a close, he took the precaution of making inquiries at the town's newspapers and the telegraph office. No one had received similar messages. No other public notice of a crime or death had been reported. The phrase "the Virgin has perished" remained a tantalizing riddle, equally likely to be a literary affectation as a genuine report. By late afternoon, the town's social life had resumed its accustomed rhythm. The mayor, affronted that his speech had been delayed, returned to his ceremonial duties with a stiff dignity. The flower show judges, all minor gentry and retired professionals, whispered about the disruption as though it were a minor stain on their otherwise impeccable record. And Purbright, quietly noting each reaction, understood that the ordinary order of Flaxborough was both resilient and delicately poised. Yet beneath the polite chatter, the understated amusement, and the mild indignation, a small tension lingered. In his experience, such cryptic notes never appeared without purpose, and human nature was such that the true author often revealed themselves in the most trivial gestures, a glance, a hesitation, a nervous cough. Purbright left the civic gardens before the crowds dispersed entirely, walking along the riverbank with its sedate swans and whispering reeds. He thought in that calm and reflective way of the many peculiarities that Flaxborough had already presented that morning. The pride of Mr. Trench, the keen observation of Miss Tolliver, the subtle agitation of Mrs. Pritchard. Each would be accounted for in due course. For now the mystery of the cryptic notes remained just that, a mystery. But Purbright, confident in the slow, deliberate methods honed over decades, knew that Flaxborough had already begun to offer him the essential threads of the story. And as he returned to the station, he did so with the unspoken awareness that small towns guard their secrets not with violence, but with politeness, with reputation, and with that peculiar mix of pride and fear that renders ordinary life quietly precarious. And in Flaxborough, even a flower show could be the prelude to something decidedly less ordinary. The morning after the flower show brought with it the usual quiet stirrings of Flaxborough, though the town now moved under the subtle shadow of the previous day's oddity. In every shop, tea-room and bus-stop, the cryptic note had become the topic of discreet conjecture, each citizen adding their own seasoning to the tale. Mrs. Pritchard, in particular, had made it her personal mission to interpret the message according to her ever-vigilant moral compass. A tragedy, certainly, she declared to anyone who would pause long enough to listen, and likely a warning about the company our young people keep. Her audience, mostly elderly ladies with tea-stained gloves, nodded gravely as though she had revealed a profound, unassailable truth. In contrast, Mr. Trench had become almost comically defensive. His early morning visit to the town council revealed a man determined to ensure that no one, not even the local constabulary, could insinuate that his roses were in any way related to the incident. "Preposterous," he said, adjusting his bowler hat with precise indignation. "Utterly preposterous. One cannot imagine my dahlias playing a part in such matters. I have always conducted myself with the utmost propriety." The council members murmured in polite agreement, though Purbright, observing from his corner with a small notebook, noted how closely Mr. Trench's hands trembled as he clasped them behind his back. At the Red Lion, the alehouse proprietor found his own establishment transformed into a de facto hub for whispered speculation. A group of local clerks, their ties slightly askew, and their gloves dusted with ink, debated possible authors of the note with the fervour usually reserved for parliamentary procedure. "It must be someone new in town," one suggested, "someone who fancies themselves clever, though they clearly lack the common decency to spell things out." "Or perhaps," countered another, lowering his voice, "it is a message intended for a single individual, one who would understand immediately while the rest of us look foolish." Purbright's inquiries began, as always, with patience. He visited the florist who had arranged the chrysanthemums, noting her delicate attempts to appear unconcerned while her fingers fidgeted with stray petals. "I noticed nothing unusual," she insisted, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "Absolutely nothing. The display was prepared with the utmost care." Yet when asked who had handled the note, her eyes flicked briefly toward the town's telegraph office, an imperceptible motion that Purbright recorded with the quiet satisfaction of a man noting a minor yet significant detail. The postmistress, meanwhile, had heard nothing from her end, though she confessed to receiving a curious early morning telegram that, in her opinion, might, or might not, have had some bearing on the matter. She could not recall the exact wording, only that it was brief and formal, and that she had handed it off without thinking much of it. Even this uncertainty, trivial as it seemed, contributed to the ever-growing lattice of speculation in which the town now wove itself tightly. As the day progressed, the pattern of gossip sharpened like the slow edge of a scythe. Each retelling added nuance. The note, previously read aloud once in the gardens, was now whispered in careful tones at the market stall, its author's identity a secret delight to every speaker. Miss Tolliver, having observed the behaviour of many townspeople with an almost academic interest, noted in a private diary that several ladies seemed to take a perverse pride in imagining themselves witnesses to some dramatic revelation, as though the note were a performance staged just for their benefit. Purbright, ever methodical, did not rush. He recorded every word, every hesitation, every micro-expression. Even those who professed ignorance revealed patterns of self-interest, rivalry, or fear. He discovered, in the course of casual observation, that Mr. Trench had quite inadvertently left a handkerchief embroidered with his initials in the chrysanthemum display area. Small, almost trivial, yet in the meticulous way of Flaxborough, potentially significant. By late afternoon, it was clear that the story had grown beyond the note itself. Citizens began speculating about the Virgin referenced, each suggestion coloured by personal fears and hopes. A local teacher, with a faintly theatrical sigh, insisted it must be the young Miss Everleigh from the boarding school, whose scrupulous behaviour had earned her the unspoken envy of her peers. A baker, more practical, whispered that it could refer to some scandalous property matter or perhaps an eccentric literary reference. The truth, as Purbright recognised, had little to do with either. It existed quietly, like a shadow at the edge of a drawing-room, waiting to be observed rather than announced. Even the police sergeant began to feel the pressure, though he would never admit it openly. Calls to the station had increased subtly, concerned citizens, idle enthusiasts, and the occasionally absurdly dramatic. Yet no crime had been reported, no one was missing, and still the town's imagination spun on, as if by some unspoken agreement to fill the emptiness with speculation. Purbright paused outside the post office near dusk, observing the fading light catch the spire of the church in a way that always seemed to mark the town's collective conscience. He reflected on the nature of gossip, how it crept into corners, lodged itself between polite facades, and whispered truths that were never quite complete. The flower show, a trivial civic amusement, had become the lens through which the town examined itself, and within that lens he could already see faint, telltale distortions. Clues, minor yet telling, waiting to be carefully disentangled. The inspector returned to his office with a quiet satisfaction, noting that tomorrow he would begin more formal interviews, though in Flaxborough, formal always retained a polite, understated quality. He placed the notes side by side on his desk, considering the rhythm of their words, the deliberate timing of their appearance, and the carefully controlled chaos that now threaded through the town. The story was far from over. It was only beginning, and Purbright, as always, would allow the town to reveal itself fully before he drew the threads together. For now, Flaxborough resumed its ordinary pace. Shop windows were dusted, the tea-rooms polished, the railway clerk fussed over his ledgers. Yet beneath the surface, a gentle tension persisted, a quiet awareness that something unusual had occurred. And in the midst of it all, Inspector Purbright, patient and unobtrusive, prepared for the slow, inevitable unravelling that was the very essence of his profession. The following morning, Inspector Purbright commenced his inquiries with the methodical patience for which he was quietly admired and occasionally misunderstood. His first visit was to the flower show secretary, Mrs. Beauchamp, who had spent the previous day fussing over every bloom as if the town's reputation depended entirely on her vigilance. She received him with a polite, anxious smile, clasping her hands so tightly that her gloves wrinkled unnaturally. "Inspector," she said, voice pitched low as though the very walls might overhear, "I simply cannot imagine who would write such a note. The very idea. It is most unseemly." "Indeed," Purbright replied, adopting his habitual tone of gentle neutrality. "And did anyone seem particularly interested in the chrysanthemums yesterday? Any unusual visitors?" Mrs. Beauchamp pursed her lips. "Unusual? No, but Mr. Trench lingered longer than he ought to have, and there was a young lady from the boarding school who glanced at the notes several times, though I think it was mere curiosity." She paused, then added almost apologetically, "I fear gossip has already begun. People are speculating wildly." Purbright noted the emphasis. Speculation, he had learned, was a far more fertile source of error and of revelation than outright deception. He scribbled a small note in his pad, careful to record the wording and emphasis precisely. His next appointment was with Mr. Trench himself, who had taken a brief respite from his rose beds to receive him in the parlour of his modest home. The bowler hat, slightly askew, did not betray the anxiety he attempted to conceal beneath layers of pride. "Inspector, I assure you my dahlias have no part in this." "Nonsense. I have always been a man of principle, he began, pacing with careful indignation. And yet, Purbright observed gently, you left your handkerchief among the chrysanthemums yesterday. A simple oversight, I imagine. Mr. Trench froze, his eyes narrowing. Well, I suppose so. One's mind, you understand, preoccupied with maintaining proper order. But it is irrelevant, I assure you. I have nothing to hide. Purbright inclined his head. Nothing to hide, he noted, rarely meant the opposite in Flaxborough. Yet he withheld comment, recording only the precise reactions, the tremor of the fingers, the sudden shift in posture, the careful choice of words. From there, he proceeded to the boarding school on the edge of town, where Miss Everleigh, a young lady whose behaviour had earned the delicate envy of local matrons, awaited his inquiry. The schoolmistress, a stern woman with an unyielding respect for routine, watched closely as Purbright approached. "Miss Everleigh," he said in his quiet, courteous manner, "yesterday you were seen observing the chrysanthemum display closely. Did anything unusual attract your attention?" The girl's gaze, steady and clear, met his. "No, sir. I merely admired the flowers, but I did notice a note on the table. I did not read it. It seemed improper." Purbright noted both her words and her composure. Not reading the note suggested innocence, yet her very awareness implied a proximity that might, in another circumstance, have been significant. Returning to the station, Purbright gathered his thoughts, reviewing the subtle inconsistencies that each interview had revealed. He was not seeking dramatic confessions, nor would he push for overt admissions. Rather, he attended to the small behavioral clues, the slight hesitation before an answer, the micro-adjustments in posture, the nuanced attempts at emphasis or dismissal. By mid-afternoon, the first obvious suspect had emerged, not from direct evidence, but from a pattern of behaviours that seemed to cluster unnaturally around the notes. Mr. Trench, with his anxious attention to propriety and the unexplained handkerchief, had drawn the quiet interest of the sergeant. A hurried report had already reached the station, suggesting that the matter could be neatly resolved if Trench were questioned further. Purbright, however, did not echo this certainty. He observed the tendency of small towns to leap to tidy conclusions, and he restrained both the sergeant and the impatient whispers of local gentry. To decide too quickly was to risk obscuring the true rhythm of events, for in Flaxborough even the most inconspicuous detail could unravel an entire narrative. That evening, as the town settled into its habitual calm, Purbright walked along the riverbank, reflecting on the day's inquiries. The sequence of observations formed a subtle mosaic: the flower show secretary's anxiety, Miss Everleigh's poised awareness, Mr. Trench's defensive indignation, the townspeople's rapid spread of speculation. Each was a thread, not yet forming a coherent picture, but hinting at a pattern beneath the ordinary surface of civic life. He paused to consider the phrasing of the notes once more. "The Virgin has perished." The words were deliberate, formal, almost literary. They spoke less of fact than of message, less of event than of intention. Someone in Flaxborough, or visiting it, had chosen to set these words before the town, expecting attention, perhaps even confusion. Purbright, in his understated manner, appreciated both the audacity and the restraint of the act. It was designed to disturb without violence, to hint without revelation. And as he returned to his office, the shadows lengthening across the cobblestones, he made a quiet note to himself. The investigation was not about force or confrontation. It would unfold through observation, patience, and the careful interpretation of human nuance. In the theatre of small-town life, a cryptic note could command attention, stir anxiety, and reveal character all at once. Tomorrow, Purbright reflected, would bring further clarity, not through haste, but through the deliberate, slow accumulation of evidence hidden in ordinary behaviour. And in Flaxborough, as always, the ordinary was never quite what it seemed. The day following Purbright's initial inquiries was marked by a curious calm in Flaxborough, though beneath it stirred a quiet, almost imperceptible tension. The townspeople went about their routines, shopkeepers dusted shelves with exaggerated care, clerks shuffled papers with a particular solemnity, and housewives compared the freshness of their bread. But the memory of the cryptic notes lingered like a whisper, just out of reach. Purbright began his morning with a measured stroll through the civic gardens once more. The chrysanthemums had been rearranged overnight, the handkerchief Mr. Trench had left conspicuously removed. Yet the inspector's keen eyes caught a subtle detail. A single chrysanthemum petal, pale at the edges, stuck in the corner of the table's lace cloth. It seemed trivial, almost absurd, but its presence, or absence, of attention had already told him more than the outward displays of propriety could. From the gardens he walked toward the railway station, ostensibly to observe arrivals and departures, but in truth to watch behaviour. A young clerk, eager to demonstrate his own acuity, fidgeted as he arranged parcels and telegrams. Purbright's glance fell upon the boy's shoes. One heel scuffed more than the other, as if he had paused repeatedly while walking. It was a minor thing, almost laughable, yet in Flaxborough minor things often held the weight of revelation. By mid-morning, a fresh layer of intrigue had been added to the town's social tapestry. Miss Tolliver, the observant spinster, had taken it upon herself to visit the post office, where she lingered over the counter as if the very act of postal sorting might yield secrets. She whispered to anyone willing to hear, though only in a tone of scholarly curiosity, that the note's language suggested someone familiar with classical literature and perhaps with a touch of theatricality. This naturally became a topic of animated discussion in the tea-rooms. Purbright, noting the directions of speculation, began widening his inquiries. He visited the Red Lion, where the proprietor, a man whose natural cheer belied a subtle hunger for gossip, confirmed that several patrons had asked questions about the Virgin reference, though none had confessed to seeing the author of the notes, and yet, even in their casual chatter, each spoke in a manner that revealed personal concern, pride, or discomfort, as though the notes had illuminated some hidden corner of their own conscience. At the same time, another minor, seemingly irrelevant incident drew Purbright's attention. In the queue at the baker's, a woman in a mauve hat dropped a letter, which a passerby returned with an apologetic bow. The handwriting, neat but distinctive, matched the typist's style of the original notes. Purbright did not mention it immediately, but he filed the observation meticulously. Often, the smallest coincidences carried the greatest weight in unravelling a human tale. By afternoon, the town council had convened an informal discussion on what precisely should be done about the matter of the notes. Here, Purbright witnessed the familiar dynamics of small-town politics. Mr. Trench took the floor with assertive indignation, proposing that the notes be treated as a prank and that their author be gently admonished rather than subjected to formal scrutiny. Mrs. Pritchard, ever vigilant of social proprieties, insisted that moral standards demanded investigation. A younger councillor, eager to demonstrate both diligence and cleverness, suggested surveillance at the Red Lion, though even he admitted that it was unclear what exactly he hoped to observe. Purbright, seated politely at the back, recorded every word. He did not intervene, nor did he yet signal any inclination toward judgment. He preferred to let the town reveal its own inclinations, to note the contradictions between spoken concern and underlying interest. It was in these nuances, subtle and often concealed, that the truth was most reliably signposted. As the afternoon waned, a new figure emerged, adding complexity to the web of observations. Mr. Elmsworth, a solicitor with a reputation for discretion and a touch of theatrical exaggeration, arrived at the town square. He inquired, in carefully measured tones, whether any official record had been made of the notes. When told that they were still held at the station, he nodded as if that were entirely proper, then lingered to study the faces of the townspeople. Purbright observed that his interest, though polite and restrained, seemed pointed toward particular individuals, most notably Mr. Trench and the young Miss Everleigh. The day's enquiries culminated in a quiet visit to the boarding school once again. The schoolmistress, now more wary of the town's gaze than of any particular threat, observed Purbright closely as he asked further questions about Miss Everleigh's movements during the flower show. The girl, composed as ever, repeated that she had admired the flowers and noticed the note, but had not touched it. Yet, in an almost imperceptible gesture, she traced the edge of a lace glove over her desk, a motion that suggested habitual caution, as though small objects or minor traces held significance in her thinking. By evening, Purbright had assembled a clear tableau of the town's current state, a society tense with curiosity, speculation, and the mild unease of reputations threatened. There were several individuals of particular note: Mr. Trench, whose pride and agitation made him a natural focal point; Miss Everleigh, whose disciplined awareness suggested both innocence and caution; and peripheral figures like Miss Tolliver and Mr. Elmsworth, whose subtle observations might yet prove consequential. And then there was the minor yet conspicuous detail that had not escaped him: the lone chrysanthemum petal from the flower show, pale at its edges, a small emblem of human carelessness or deliberate misplacement. Its significance was not yet clear, but Purbright knew that the story of the notes, the town, and the mysterious virgin would pivot upon such trifles. Walking home as twilight settled over Flaxborough, Purbright reflected on the slow, deliberate unfolding of human nature. The town was revealing itself, layer by layer, through behavior, conversation, and subtle hesitation. The notes were a lens, not the story itself. They drew forth anxieties, rivalries, and pride, making the ordinary extraordinary. And through it all, Purbright maintained his characteristic patience, confident that the eventual truth, concealed, nuanced, and human, would emerge naturally when the time was right. He placed a final call to the Red Lion before retiring, to observe, to note arrivals and departures, to see who lingered where and for how long. The town's small dramas were, as always, interwoven with the simplest gestures and the quietest truths. In Flaxborough, the ordinary and the extraordinary were never far apart, and the detective's task was to discern which threads mattered and which were merely frayed edges of social custom. The morning after the town council's discussion arrived with an unremarkable serenity, yet Purbright sensed an undercurrent of anticipation threading through Flaxborough. The previous day's inquiries had revealed patterns, hinted at motivations, and quietly unsettled several residents, though no one would admit to feeling unsettled aloud. In Flaxborough, even the smallest disturbance demanded discretion. Purbright's first call was to the Red Lion, where the proprietor greeted him with a mixture of habitual civility and concealed eagerness. "Inspector," he said, polishing a brass bell absent-mindedly, "there has been a bit of excitement overnight. Not scandalous, you understand, but noteworthy." "Do elaborate," Purbright replied, his tone polite, his eyes narrowing subtly. Someone broke the rear window," the man said, lowering his voice. "No entry taken, nothing stolen, just the glass." Purbright noted the phrasing. No entry taken, nothing stolen. An act that announced itself, yet accomplished nothing. Such gestures in small towns often conveyed messages rather than material gain. Walking to the scene, Purbright observed the shards of glass glinting faintly in the morning sun. There was no sign of forced entry beyond the smashed window pane, and no footprints of consequence. The disturbance had been superficial, almost theatrical, as though designed to attract attention without direct confrontation. He recorded the detail carefully, recognizing that the timing following the cryptic notes was far from coincidental. As he questioned the Red Lion staff and the occasional lingering patron, Purbright discerned the subtle frictions of gossip and reputation. A barmaid mentioned seeing Mr. Trench loitering near the establishment the previous evening, though she could not recall precisely when. Another witness suggested that Miss Everleigh had passed nearby on her way home from a tutoring session, though again, only a vague approximation of time could be provided. Every statement was tinged with uncertainty, yet collectively they formed a lattice of proximity and observation. Returning to the station, Purbright reviewed the existing records, noting the peculiar convergence of minor events, the initial notes, the chrysanthemum petal, the handkerchief, and now the broken window. None of these amounted to crime in the conventional sense, yet together they suggested deliberate action intended to communicate, unsettle, or provoke. By afternoon, the investigation had drawn in new participants. Mr. Elmsworth, the solicitor, visited with a careful air of concern, ostensibly to offer advice on the legality of such disturbances, though Purbright noted the keen, measuring glance he cast at Mr. Trench upon arrival. Meanwhile, Miss Tolliver circulated quietly among the tea rooms, hinting at possible literary or moral interpretations of the events, delighting in the theatricality of her own conjectures. It was at this point that a second incident, more concrete, yet equally cryptic, occurred. A parcel, addressed ambiguously and left at the post office, contained a single item. A small, framed portrait of a young woman, apparently long deceased, with a card attached. Reading only, "Observe closely. Truth is in the details." The postmistress, initially flustered, delivered the parcel to the station with a mixture of indignation and curiosity. Purbright examined it calmly, noting the craftsmanship of the frame, the quality of the photograph, and the precise wording of the card. All suggested deliberate intention rather than random mischief. The portrait, while poignant, added nothing to the concrete narrative, yet its arrival shifted the tone of the enquiry, from playful speculation to a carefully orchestrated, if obscure, drama. Throughout the day, Purbright conducted further interviews, each revealing subtle contradictions. Mr. Trench insisted he had not been near the post office, though an innkeeper recalled seeing him in the vicinity. Miss Everleigh maintained that she had spent the afternoon quietly at home, yet an observant neighbour mentioned a fleeting glimpse of her figure near the town square. Purbright did not press for confessions. Instead, he allowed these inconsistencies to accumulate, noting that human nature was most revealing when people believed they were neither observed nor suspected. By evening, he had also observed the patterns of the townspeople's gossip. Mrs. Pritchard, perturbed by the parcel, suggested that the incidents were some form of moral admonition, possibly aimed at the youth. Miss Tolliver conversely speculated that the events were artistic, a private performance intended for an audience of one. Both perspectives, while differing in tone, underscored the essential point. The town's attention had been fully captured, and each citizen revealed their own character through conjecture. Purbright reflected quietly on the sequence of events. The initial cryptic note had been a trigger. The handkerchief and the lone petal had been subtle markers. The smashed window had announced presence without theft, and now the portrait carried a silent, almost theatrical demand for observation. All were deliberate acts, human in their design, each intended to provoke awareness and perhaps discomfort. It was, he concluded, a matter of intention rather than consequence. Flaxborough, so devoted to routine and civility, had been invited into a game, one that could be won or lost by the smallest gestures, the slightest reveals, and the most understated observation. Purbright, in his usual reflective manner, understood that the forthcoming days would require patience, careful listening, and the subtle interpretation of human foibles. And as the town prepared for the evening, resuming its quiet rhythms with the pretense of ordinary routine, Purbright allowed himself the faintest trace of anticipation. The game had begun in earnest, and every resident, whether aware or not, was playing a part. The truth, he knew, would emerge not through force, but through the patient accumulation of small, deliberate signs. And in Flaxborough, as always, the ordinary contained the extraordinary, waiting only for the attentive eye to discern it. But the following morning, Flaxborough awoke with the peculiar stillness that often precedes revelation. Shops opened as usual, the grocer arranged his vegetables with meticulous care, and the postmistress moved efficiently between counter and ledger. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of the cryptic notes, the smashed window, and the portrait lingered like a fine mist, colouring every glance and gesture with subtle unease. Purbright began his day at the station, reviewing the accumulated observations and minor contradictions of the past week. He did not rush to conclusions. Instead, he allowed the events to form a slowly emerging pattern. Human behaviour, he reflected, rarely lies outright. It hides, refracts, and distorts, revealing its truth in pauses, in micro-expressions, in hesitations that are almost imperceptible. These were the clues he pursued with quiet diligence. A report from the railway station caught his attention. A small parcel had arrived for Mr. Elmsworth, delivered without announcement. The envelope was plain, unremarkable, yet the handwriting matched that of the cryptic notes. Purbright requested to see it, noting the careful choice of ink and the precise, formal script. The content was brief, a simple list of names, each crossed out in order, with one left uncrossed. The implication was subtle but clear. Someone was marking time or progress in a manner deliberately private, yet designed to be intercepted. He visited the Red Lion once again, observing the townspeople as they moved through the public rooms with the air of casual, unremarkable citizens. The innkeeper's face, usually placid, betrayed a faint tension, and several regular patrons whispered in corners while pretending to examine the daily newspapers. Purbright noted the ebb and flow of attention, the small interruptions, the slight inclination of heads toward one another, as if to confirm shared suspicions. In Flaxborough, even ordinary curiosity could become a revelatory instrument. By mid-morning, he returned to the flower show grounds. The chrysanthemums had been left undisturbed, yet the air of civility was now punctuated with cautious glances among exhibitors. One young man, responsible for watering the displays, avoided direct eye contact when Purbright passed. A faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted a vase did not escape the inspector's notice. It was trivial, almost laughable, yet in Flaxborough, triviality often bore the weight of truth. Purbright's reflections that day extended to human nature itself. He considered the peculiar way the town had absorbed the cryptic communications, how reputation, pride, and subtle fear intertwined to create a social theatre of observation and conjecture. Some, like Mr. Trench, were overtly defensive, their pride exposed in micro-gestures. Others, like Miss Everleigh, remained composed, revealing character in the smallest hesitations or in the care with which they avoided errors of perception. Even peripheral figures, the solicitor, the spinster, the tea-room habitués, contributed to the mosaic of behaviour, each adding threads to the evolving pattern. In the afternoon, Purbright orchestrated a quiet test. He visited the post office under the guise of collecting routine mail, speaking to the staff with casual cordiality. In conversation, he referred to the previous day's parcel, feigning casual curiosity. The reactions were telling. The postmistress's eyes flickered, the counter-clerk adjusted his ledger unnecessarily, and a passerby, someone who had lingered in the doorway, shifted his weight nervously. Each minor action was noted and mentally catalogued. By evening, the inspector had begun to sketch an outline of likely connections. The sequence of cryptic notes, minor disturbances, and subtle gestures suggested not random mischief, but deliberate orchestration. Someone in Flaxborough, or visiting it, was employing theatre, misdirection, and psychological nuance to convey a message, and the town's natural tendency toward gossip and conjecture had amplified the effect. Purbright paused to consider the ethical dimension. The acts were minor, non-violent, yet charged with intent. In Flaxborough, the social consequences of even the smallest affront could be considerable, and the inspector understood that patience, discretion, and subtle testing were the tools most likely to reveal truth without escalating distress. As twilight approached, he returned to his office, placing the collected notes, observations, and minor anomalies side by side. The chrysanthemum petal, the handkerchief, the broken window, the portrait, the parcel, all these details seemed disparate at first glance. Yet, as always, the truth in Flaxborough was concealed not in overt evidence, but in pattern, repetition, and the alignment of human behaviour. Purbright considered the next steps carefully. He would continue to observe the town, encourage subtle interactions, and introduce small, deliberate prompts to test reactions. In such matters, he knew that revelation arrived not through force, but through patience, and the careful orchestration of social circumstance. In the stillness of the evening, as lamplights flickered across the cobbled streets, the inspector reflected on the quiet majesty of small-town human complexity. Every hesitation, every glance, every whispered conjecture was a fragment of narrative. And in Flaxborough, he mused, even the most trivial act, a dropped handkerchief, a misplaced petal, a casual comment, might be the key to understanding the whole. By the time he set down his pen, the town had settled into its usual rhythms, though a subtle tension lingered. Flaxborough's ordinary life, so carefully ordered, had been gently disturbed, and Purbright, patient, unhurried, and quietly attentive, was confident that the resolution would arrive in its own time, as naturally and unobtrusively as the small details that heralded it. The following morning, Flaxborough seemed no different from any other, though beneath its placid exterior a subtle energy had begun to accumulate. The events of the preceding days, the cryptic notes, the minor disturbances, and the delicate theatre of observation had awakened a faint tension among the townsfolk. People moved with an air of mild expectancy, glancing at one another as if anticipating some quiet revelation. Purbright began his day at the market, where he observed the circulation of gossip with characteristic patience. The butcher, who usually offered only curt nods, had grown unexpectedly loquacious, subtly inquiring whether anyone had seen Miss Everleigh or Mr. Trench since the previous evening. The greengrocer, ever polite, added his own conjectures about possible literary or moral undertones of the notes, and the baker, more practical, wondered aloud whether the incidents were intended to shame someone in particular. Each remark, though casual, revealed personal anxieties and hidden preoccupations, creating a lattice of social tension for Purbright to examine. By mid-morning, new characters began to weave themselves into the narrative. Mrs. Crompton, a widow renowned for her keen eye and quiet influence among the local matrons, approached the inspector with carefully phrased questions about the parcels and the portrait. She suggested that someone in town might be orchestrating events deliberately to unsettle reputations, though she could not specify who. Her observations, delivered with impeccable propriety, contained subtle hints of knowledge beyond her stated facts. Purbright next visited the boarding school, where Miss Everleigh's calm composure contrasted sharply with the anxious whispers circulating outside. The schoolmistress, now fully aware of the town's scrutiny, spoke carefully, noting that the girl had conducted herself with her usual decorum but had expressed curiosity about the notes. Purbright listened attentively, noting that Miss Everleigh's manner was composed yet precise, as though every action had been rehearsed for the sake of propriety. At the Red Lion, the inn's public rooms had become a quiet theatre of observation. Patrons who ordinarily carried on mundane conversation now spoke in half-formed whispers, their eyes flicking toward the door at each arrival. Mr. Elmsworth appeared once more, observing the assembly with deliberate politeness, while Miss Tolliver circulated among small groups, framing her conjectures in carefully measured tones. Even the innkeeper, usually impervious to social subtleties, seemed caught between hospitality and discreet attention. By early afternoon, Purbright had begun noting patterns in these interactions. The minor contradictions and hesitations observed over several days were beginning to align. Mr. Trench's agitation, Miss Everleigh's careful movements, the solicitor's pointed glances, and Mrs. Crompton's indirect insights. Each was a thread in a larger tapestry, suggesting connections that were invisible to the casual observer, but clear in the context of accumulated behaviour. It was during a quiet walk along the riverbank that Purbright noticed another minor but telling detail. A discarded glove, pale at the edges, tucked beneath a bench. He retrieved it carefully, noting its size, the quality of its stitching, and a faint trace of soil. It was a trivial object, almost laughable in its simplicity, yet its presence at that precise location hinted at human movement, attention, or forgetfulness. Such small acts, he knew, were often the most reliable indicators of intent and circumstance. Returning to the station, Purbright reviewed the events, the notes, the handkerchief, the chrysanthemum petal, the broken window, the portrait, the new parcel, and now the glove. Each had been minor in isolation, but collectively revealed a deliberate orchestration of minor disturbances and hints. The second incident, the parcel with the photograph, had shifted the town from idle speculation to quiet apprehension, and now the accumulation of subtle cues suggested that the game being played was both patient and precise. By evening he considered the implications of his observations. Flaxborough had become a theatre in which small gestures carried disproportionate weight. The true challenge lay not in discovering a dramatic act of crime, but in discerning the motives and intentions behind these carefully staged trifles. The town, with its layers of etiquette, rivalry, and hidden pride, was revealing its character through what it chose to notice and what it chose to conceal. As twilight settled, Purbright returned to the Red Lion to observe the final movements of the day. Patrons lingered with polite restraint, tea and ale cups left half full as conversations tapered off. The minor disturbances, the whispered conjectures, and the gentle watchfulness of the town had created a pattern of subtle tension. And within that tension, Purbright recognized the delicate rhythm of human behavior, the very thing he had been patiently tracking all along. He retired to his office with a quiet satisfaction. The threads were aligning. The next phase of the investigation, he knew, would require carefully staged questions and deliberate observation, tests designed to elicit reaction without force. In Flaxborough, the truth would emerge not through confrontation, but through the quiet unfolding of human nature itself. The next morning, the town of Flaxborough seemed to move with its habitual rhythm, though Purbright noted the slight tightness in posture, the extra caution in steps, the subtle attentiveness of those who had yesterday seemed entirely ordinary. Even the birds on the riverbank paused briefly as though sensing the invisible tension that lingered in the air. Purbright began his observations at the town square, where vendors had arranged their stalls with meticulous care, and customers murmured softly over produce, carefully modulating their tones. The inspector's attention, however, was drawn to the behaviour of those who had previously appeared peripheral. Mr. Elmsworth, the solicitor, lingered by the fountain, ostensibly checking letters, yet his glances swept systematically over the crowd. Miss Tolliver, the spinster, moved from bench to bench, as if sampling the town's reactions with scholarly scrutiny. Both were minor actors in the broader stage, yet their interest in particular individuals, Mr. Trench, Miss Everleigh, suggested a quiet alignment of curiosity, or perhaps a subtle alliance in observation. By late morning, Purbright returned to the Red Lion to witness a series of interactions that, though understated, offered insights. Mr. Trench arrived with a deliberate air of composure, yet the moment his eyes fell upon Miss Everleigh, his hand tightened on the handle of his walking stick. Miss Everleigh, in turn, did not look away, yet she made no motion to approach, maintaining a careful distance that was as precise as it was polite. The innkeeper, observant of both patrons and ordinary business, gave no overt signal, though his subtle arching of the brow indicated awareness of tension. During the afternoon, Purbright received a note of minor but peculiar importance. The message had been left anonymously at the station, slipped under the door in neat handwriting, and read, "Observe where attention falters. That is where truth sleeps." It was phrased in a manner reminiscent of the cryptic notes, and while it contained no accusation, it underscored a theme he had already discerned, that the orchestrator of the disturbances sought to manipulate attention, to elicit subtle reaction rather than provoke overt alarm. Later, a minor incident at the flower show grounds further reinforced the pattern. A small vase, placed carefully among the chrysanthemums, had been slightly displaced. No one admitted to touching it, yet its movement was obvious to anyone who observed closely. Purbright considered the triviality of the act and noted the reactions of those nearby. A young lady from the boarding school glanced furtively at the vase before returning her attention to her companions. Mr. Trench paused mid-step, then adjusted the angle of a nearby bench with unusual deliberation. Each action, minute as it was, hinted at awareness of both observer and observed. Returning to his office, Purbright reflected on the events of the past week. The town's ordinary routines had become a theatre in which each citizen, knowingly or unknowingly, revealed character through micro-actions. The cryptic notes, the parcels, the broken window, the displaced petal, the glove, all served as instruments to orchestrate attention, provoke subtle discomfort, or test reactions. And the town, with its ingrained habits of politeness, pride, and curiosity, responded predictably, yet in ways that revealed far more than any single overt act could. That evening, Purbright considered the implications of private reflection. Each individual's response to minor provocations, hesitation, subtle correction, carefully modulated speech, provided insight into character, motive, and awareness. Mr. Trench's pride and composure masked anxiety. Miss Everleigh's careful precision suggested both innocence and caution. Mr. Elmsworth's polite scrutiny concealed an interest that was deliberate rather than casual. And Miss Tolliver's scholarly manner masked enjoyment of subtle theatrics. It became clear to Purbright that the forthcoming steps of his investigation would require carefully staged tests. Minor interventions designed to provoke reaction without overt confrontation. The orchestrator of the disturbances, having relied on subtle cues to manipulate the town's attention, would respond in ways that revealed intent, alliances, and perhaps culpability. As he walked along the riverbank that evening, Purbright noted the soft murmur of water over stones, the gentle sway of reeds, and the quiet attention of a few late pedestrians. The ordinary world in Flaxborough was never quite ordinary. Within the smallest gestures, the quietest pauses, and the seemingly trivial anomalies lay the patterns he sought. The subtle orchestration of human behavior was his domain, and he approached it with the calm certainty that only patience, observation, and a disciplined eye could bring. By nightfall, the town had resumed its habitual routines, yet a quiet tension lingered like a note sustained just beyond hearing. And in that sustained note, Purbright discerned promise. That the truth, when it emerged, would be measured, precise, and unmistakable, revealed through the very patterns that had, until now, concealed it. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke with an almost imperceptible shift in tempo. Shops opened with customary care, though the proprietors moved with an added deliberation, their eyes flicking toward the streets as if anticipating some subtle development. The postmistress arranged letters with her usual efficiency, yet the glances she cast toward the counter betrayed curiosity tinged with unease. Purbright noted it all, recording behaviour as precisely as he would evidence, though the nature of the clues was far more human than criminal. By mid-morning he began his deliberate test, framed as a polite inquiry. A small invitation, under the guise of casual civility, was extended to Mr. Trench, asking him to accompany Purbright on a walk through the flower show grounds. The wording was neutral, almost perfunctory, yet the intent was precise, to observe reaction under conditions that allowed concealment of scrutiny. Mr. Trench, naturally proud of his knowledge of horticulture, accepted with measured enthusiasm, unaware of the subtle purpose behind the invitation. As they strolled, Purbright made careful, understated observations. Mr. Trench adjusted a chrysanthemum pot several times, seemingly concerned with alignment, yet his movements betrayed a faint unease. He paused at a particular note, pinned inconspicuously to the notice board, glanced about the empty grounds and muttered, "One wonders at the propriety of such things." Purbright registered the phrasing and tone, polite, formal, yet revealing an internal calculation of both risk and reputation. Later, a second test was orchestrated with Miss Everleigh. A visit to the town square was suggested under the pretext of delivering a parcel for the boarding school. The parcel contained nothing of consequence, yet its careful presentation and the casual attention of observers introduced a minor pressure. Miss Everleigh's response was precise. She moved deliberately, avoided unnecessary contact and maintained an awareness of all present, yet her composure remained unbroken. Purbright noted the faintest quiver in her hand as she adjusted a ribbon on the package, a minor tremor that in context hinted at both conscientiousness and apprehension. Meanwhile, peripheral figures continued to play their subtle roles. Mr. Elmsworth lingered near the post office, ostensibly checking correspondence, but his glances were pointed, scanning for minor reactions among the townspeople. Miss Tolliver circulated through the tea rooms, framing her observations as casual conversation, yet each comment was calculated to elicit micro-responses, a flicker of attention, a shift in posture, a micro-expression of surprise. By afternoon, these orchestrated encounters had begun to reveal faint patterns. Mr. Trench's meticulous attention, the slight tremor in Miss Everleigh's hand, the solicitor's discreet surveying, and the spinster's subtle provocations collectively suggested awareness, concern, and the careful concealment of interest. Purbright, seated quietly in a corner of the Red Lion, observed the interplay of human behaviour as if it were a delicate performance, noting reactions in silence while maintaining the guise of casual patronage. A minor but telling detail emerged during a brief interlude near the flower show grounds. The lone chrysanthemum petal, previously observed, had been slightly displaced once more. Purbright noted which direction it had shifted and compared it to previous observations. The movement was minor, almost laughable, yet the alignment with Mr. Trench's and Miss Everleigh's positions suggested that attention, or avoidance, was being signalled with subtlety. In Flaxborough, even trivial actions could carry weight. By evening, the results of Purbright's tests were clear in outline, though not in full. The town's ordinary rhythms remained, yet beneath the surface, small reactions, gestures, and expressions had been recorded, catalogued, and analysed. Patterns of attention, hesitation, and propriety had emerged, revealing the alignment of concern, pride, and deliberate concealment among the principal characters. Purbright, reflecting on the day, recognized that the next steps would require careful interpretation of these reactions, connecting each minor clue to the broader orchestration of events. The cryptic notes, the parcels, the window, the petal, and the subtle tests had formed a lattice of human behavior. In this lattice, the orchestrator's intent was detectable not through confession, but through the delicate interplay of attention, observation, and reaction. As he returned to his office, the inspector considered the theatre of Flaxborough once more, the minor gestures, the careful speech, the half-concealed anxieties, all contributing to a narrative that was more social than criminal, more human than legal. And in this theatre, Purbright understood that the final reveal would be calm, precise, and civil, unfolding not with drama, but with the measured certainty that comes from patience, observation, and the quiet accumulation of subtle evidence. The morning light filtered softly through the windows of Purbright's office, and he reviewed his meticulous notes with the calm concentration of a chess master arranging pieces for the decisive move. Each minor event, the notes, the handkerchief, the chrysanthemum petal, the broken window, the portrait, the glove, and the subtle tests of the previous day, had been catalogued and cross-referenced. The evidence was not dramatic, nor were there confessions, but the patterns were clear, and the town itself had unwittingly supplied most of the data. Purbright decided to implement a quiet, controlled confrontation. It was not a confrontation in the sense of accusation, but a polite provocation designed to observe reaction and elicit telltale behavior. The choice of setting was deliberate, the Red Lion during a gentle lull in patrons, where civility constrained exaggeration yet allowed subtle gestures to manifest. Mr. Trench arrived punctually, his expression composed, but Purbright noted the slight flicker of his gaze as he scanned the room. Miss Everleigh followed shortly after, moving with her habitual care, and taking her seat in a manner that suggested attention to both posture and proximity. Mr. Elmsworth lingered near the counter, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, and Miss Tolliver took a seat in the corner, her notebook open as though for purely academic observation. Purbright, with polite warmth, initiated conversation on the flower show, inquiring after minor details, making innocuous remarks about arrangement, timing, and public interest. Each statement was carefully calibrated. The questions were casual, but the observations were deliberate. He noted the reactions in microcosm, the quick adjustment of Mr. Trench's waistcoat, the measured glance Miss Everleigh cast toward the innkeeper, the subtle tilt of Mr. Elmsworth's head as he followed the conversation, and the barely perceptible smile on Miss Tolliver's lips. At the opportune moment, Purbright introduced a minor anomaly. A single chrysanthemum, carefully selected from the show, was placed conspicuously near the table where the group gathered. Its presence was technically innocuous, yet in context it represented both familiarity with the events and a subtle signal of oversight. Mr. Trench, unable to resist the imperfection in placement, reached forward to adjust it, and his fingers hesitated over the stem, a pause that, in Purbright's estimation, revealed both preoccupation and recognition. Miss Everleigh's reaction was quieter but equally telling. Her eyes traced the flower, then returned to Purbright with a glance that carried both acknowledgement and restraint. Mr. Elmsworth, whose interest had previously been concealed under formal civility, leaned slightly forward, pen poised over his notebook, as if compelled to capture observation rather than engage directly. And Miss Tolliver, silently enjoying the theatre, recorded every nuance with a careful, practiced hand. Purbright allowed the moment to extend without comment, observing how minor provocations shaped behavior, how attention and hesitation intertwined to reveal intention. It was in these subtle acts, adjusted glances, minute gestures, and the precise timing of attention that truth would emerge. By mid-afternoon, Purbright initiated a brief discussion of the cryptic notes, framing them as curiosities rather than accusations. "One wonders," he said lightly, "whether the author intended amusement, instruction, or merely reflection upon human character." The phrasing was neutral, yet the implications were clear. Reactions followed almost immediately. Mr. Trench's lips tightened, Miss Everleigh's fingers pressed briefly together, and Mr. Elmsworth's pen hovered mid-air, betraying a conscious pause. Even Miss Tolliver, whose amusement was open, shifted slightly as though reminded that observation had consequences. In the ensuing silence, Purbright allowed himself a quiet reflection. The town of Flaxborough had performed admirably, revealing character and motive without overt confrontation. Each participant had, through attention, gesture, and subtle disclosure, contributed to the pattern that would allow the final reveal to be conducted with civility and precision. There was no need for dramatics. The truth would emerge naturally, calmly, and unmistakably. As evening approached, he reviewed his notes once more, organizing them by observation, reaction, and subtle micro-indication. The town, he reflected, was a theatre of human nature, and he, as always, the quiet audience and patient stage manager. Tomorrow, he knew, the final explanation would unfold. The threads had been gathered. The moment of revelation was imminent. The morning air in Flaxborough was calm, almost deceptively ordinary. Shops opened with their usual diligence, the postmistress arranged letters with quiet precision, and the Red Lion prepared for its morning patrons. Yet beneath this veneer of normality, an unseen tension lingered, a sense that subtle reckoning had arrived. Purbright, arriving at the inn early, observed the streets with characteristic patience, noting the soft glances of early pedestrians and the careful comportment of shopkeepers. His plan for the day was simple yet deliberate. A small assembly of key figures would gather at the Red Lion: Mr. Trench, Miss Everleigh, Mr. Elmsworth, Miss Tolliver, and a few peripheral but observant townsfolk. The intention was not to accuse, but to allow the natural culmination of events to be revealed through careful exposition and social observation. As the group assembled, Purbright welcomed them with the usual courtesy, seating each according to social convention. He opened with remarks on the flower show, the recent minor disturbances, and the curious parcels, framing each as interesting observations rather than events warranting alarm. The casual tone encouraged composure, while the sequence of remarks allowed subtle cues to manifest naturally. "The town, of course," Purbright began gently, "has responded admirably to the curious developments of recent days. Each gesture, each note, each misplaced object has been observed, recorded, and reflected upon, yet, as is often the case, the simplest details reveal the most." His eyes swept the group with quiet discernment, noting posture, gesture, and the briefest flickers of expression. He began with the handkerchief, recovered near the flower show. This, though small, was not merely lost. It was placed as a test of attention, and the reactions it provoked were telling. Mr. Trench's fingers twitched briefly, and Miss Everleigh adjusted her seating subtly, while Mr. Elmsworth's pen paused mid-note. Next, the chrysanthemum petal. A minor token, yet observed with meticulous care by certain parties. Its displacement demonstrated both awareness and the inclination to conceal interest. In Flaxborough, such small gestures are rarely accidental. The group remained composed, but each micro-reaction confirmed recognition and involvement. Purbright continued with the smashed window, the anonymous parcel, and the photograph, connecting each to the behavioral patterns observed over the past week. Notice, if you will, how attention is divided, how subtle hesitation reveals understanding. No act has been without purpose, yet none required force or confrontation. The inspector's final observations turned to the glove, the minor anomalies at the flower show, and the notes that had set events in motion. Each small occurrence, he said, has been designed to elicit reflection, test propriety, and reveal character, and in each case the town has performed admirably, demonstrating both restraint and discernment. A silence followed, during which the assembled figures absorbed the connections. Then softly but clearly Purbright concluded, "The orchestrator of these events is none other than Miss Tolliver, not in malice, nor in deception, but in the spirit of observation and subtle revelation. The minor disturbances, the cryptic notes, the parcels, all were designed to reveal character, to test attention, and to illuminate the intricate weave of human behavior within this town." Miss Tolliver's smile, faint but unmistakable, confirmed the deduction. She inclined her head, acknowledging the quiet triumph of her little game. Mr. Trench exhaled softly, relief mingled with chagrin, while Miss Everleigh's eyes reflected mild astonishment tempered by understanding. Mr. Elmsworth made a slight, approving nod, recognizing both the ingenuity and civility of the approach. Purbright's final words, delivered with calm courtesy, tied together the subtle threads. In Flaxborough, as always, the extraordinary is concealed within the ordinary. Attention, observation, and restraint have revealed truth where force could not. And now, having witnessed the culmination, we may all return to the rhythms of ordinary life, enriched by the quiet understanding of human nature. The town resumed its usual activities, yet with a faint echo of awareness. Patrons moved with gentler attentiveness, conversations contained hints of reflective amusement, and the Red Lion returned to routine without the slightest need for dramatics. Purbright returned to his office, content in the knowledge that the resolution had been achieved with civility, precision, and the understated satisfaction that only careful observation could provide. Flaxborough, in its habitual tranquillity, had been tested, observed, and revealed itself through the quiet theatre of human behaviour. And, in that subtle revelation, the mystery had concluded